Sylvia Likens was just 16 years old when she endured one of the worst forms of torture done to her that the entire state of Indiana had ever seen. All due to the hands of a bitter and evil woman who was just jealous of this 16-year-old girl for just being beautiful. This woman was supposed to take care of Sylvia and her sister Jenny while their parents were gone working. Not only did this woman torture Sylvia, even her own children and the neighborhood kids would come in to pay money to torture Sylvia. The following 3 months would be a haunting experience for Sylvia, Jenny, and the entire state of Indiana, to the point they even created a new law. Welcome to the Decomposing Flower podcast. I'm your host, Jen, and with me is Kira. In this podcast, we discuss all sorts of interesting cases that we find disturbing, interesting, or just scary or upsetting. In today's episode, we are going to be discussing the brutal torture and murder of Sylvia Likens that was done to her over the course of a few months in 1965. Before we begin, I want to give a few trigger warnings. So, abusive relationships, miscarriage, child abuse, child neglect, sexual abuse, basically all forms of abuse, torture, bodily harm, murder, and honestly, a shitty justice system. This is an extreme case of torture and abuse, and there will be some heavy descriptions of it. I'm going to try and do my best to not be too grotesque with it, but if any of that is a trigger or will be upsetting for you, please take care of yourself, and if you want to watch another one of our episodes, or do whatever you need to do, but we'll see you in the next one. I mean no harm towards Sylvia, her family, or anyone that is affected by this case. Everything that is stated in this is information that I have found online, and if I make any wrong statements or wrong information, feel free to correct us. And any opinion is strictly my opinion alone, and I don't speak for anyone else but my own. So, with that, I think we can begin. Sylvia Likens was born on January 3rd, 1949 in Lebanon, Indiana, in the United States. She was born between two sets of twins, making her the third child out of 5, so she was really the middle child. She always felt like everyone else had someone except for her, because obviously her siblings all had each other, they were twins, and she always kind of felt a bit like an outcast, but this didn't really stop Sylvia from having a really gentle and kind spirit. She was absolutely loved by everyone. She was just absolutely kind. She had a lot of friends. Her friends actually nicknamed her Cookie, which I just think is kind of a funny and cute nickname. She got a lot of attention from boys because she was very pretty, and I think, she was kind of one of those girls that's like really popular, but she's also really nice too. So people just want to be around her. People like that. She was kind of like your average girl in the 60s. She loved the Beatles, and she even liked roller skating. Sylvia was outgoing and she was confident, even though she had a missing front tooth due to her roughhousing with one of her brothers, and it got kicked out of her mouth when she was 7 years old. But Sylvia was very protective of her younger sister Jenny. Jenny had polio, and so she had to wear a brace on one of her feet, and this made Jenny very insecure, and Sylvia kind of understood that with, missing her tooth, and she would make sure to take good care of Jenny, making sure that she would take Jenny out skating, because, Jenny was really insecure about being out in public, and Sylvia kind of put on this older sister act. So, yeah, she just took good care of her sister. Her parents, Lester and Betty Likens, they had a really unsteady relationship with the fact that they were very poor. Lester was not, very smart. He only had an 8th grade education, and so that meant he struggled to get, decent jobs. And the parents would do different jobs here and there. Lester would kind of, he ran a restaurant for a bit until he had to close it. He worked in a laundromat, but nothing really stuck through, so they really struggled to make ends meet. But eventually, Lester and Betty found some good income by working at carnivals and they would work in these like standalone concession stands where they would sell things like popcorn, beer, candy, and they made a lot of good money. And so when it got to like 1965, Lester and Betty were both like, hey, we should do this again. This is great money. And they decided that that's what they were going to do this year. But they didn't want to bring Sylvia or Jenny along because they didn't want them to get the wrong attention. At this time, Jenny, I believe, was 14 and Sylvia was 16, and they just didn't want them to get the wrong attention from men, which I think is very ironic for this case, that they were worried about like Sylvia getting like assaulted. And I just think it's kind of very haunting when you hear that. But this case kind of begins in July of 1965. On July 3rd, Betty was out shopping and she got caught shoplifting and she was arrested. And so Lester, he went to go get the daughters, and that's when he had met this woman named Gertrude Baniszewski through, I believe, a mutual friend. She was the single mom of 7 kids, and 2 of her daughters, Paula and Stephanie, were acquainted with the sisters, Sylvia and Jenny. They went to the same school, and so Gertrude went through a lot of crazy abusive situations. She was born at the very start of the Great Depression, and she was a daddy's girl, which actually caused her mom to be very jealous. In my research, it didn't say that there was anything creepy going on. I just think that her mom was just one of those mothers that's just jealous of their daughters being close to their father. And so this caused her mom to get really nasty to her and degrade her. When Gertrude was 11, she was out in the field and she saw her father die, and she called for her mom and her sisters, and her mom immediately blamed her, said it was her fault. And this is kind of when more of the abuse started after her dad died. I think maybe her dad like defended her a lot. I'm not too sure, but after her dad died, her mom and the siblings would continue to harass Gertrude. They would accuse her of a lot of things. They would call her a prostitute, a whore, which is kind of going to be a common theme mentioned in this case. Eventually, Gertrude dropped out of high school at 16 and married her high school sweetheart, who was John Baniszewski. So John was a terrible man. He was absolutely abusive. He was the kind of abuser that just beat his wife because he just found her annoying. And they went on to have 4 kids, and he just was not a good man. And so after 10 years, he actually divorced Gertrude. Not long after that, Gertrude actually ended up meeting another man named Edward, who eventually divorced her after 3 months of not liking that she had children. I believe Gertrude went after some men because she needed money. She struggled to make anything. She didn't really have an education. She didn't have enough money, and she just needed a man to take care of her, I think. But I'm not too sure about her relationship with Edward. I find it very interesting that he would kind of be like, oh, I don't like that you have kids, when it's like, didn't you kind of meet her and she had them already? But maybe he just couldn't handle it anymore. I'm not too sure. Due to her being poor, she actually went back to her first husband, John, where they actually went on to have 2 more kids, and they stayed together for another 7 years. The abuse didn't stop. He went back to being very abusive to Gertrude, but then he went on to abuse the kids in the house. And Gertrude did not want to become like her mother. She had swore that she was never going to let her kids be abused or become an abuser. And so she actually left him in 1963. She ended up having another relationship shortly after this with a man named Dennis Lee. He was also abusive and a lot younger than her. She was 37 and he was 23. So there was a huge age gap there. They also were having an affair. Dennis I think he was recently married, or he was married for sure. And she tried to get him to leave his wife, but he was like, I'm not doing that. And then she got pregnant with him. And I think she thought that this would kind of convince him to stay, but he actually got angry and he beat her. She ended up having a miscarriage, and she would go on to have 6 more miscarriages. But eventually she was pregnant again, and she kind of kept it a secret from Dennis for a little while until she no longer could. And when she told Dennis that she was pregnant, he was actually really calm. and quiet, which wasn't usual. And so she felt like things had changed finally. Maybe this had convinced him. And so when she gave birth to this baby, she comes home and the house is quiet. Dennis had left her. So now Gertrude has like 7 kids and she's beginning to hate her children. She blamed them for all of the men leaving her, that men just didn't want her because, you know, she wasn't desirable anymore, and she had all these kids and she had all this baggage, and she kind of believed that her kids were the reason men didn't like her. And she began to become a lot more neglectful towards her children and abusive, you know, just being nasty to them, being very mean. But she also was very neglectful with the fact that she just didn't have any money. She couldn't take care of her kids. The money that she did get would go towards the baby, getting milk for this baby, who she actually named Dennis after the father. Gertrude was always insecure. I think she believed that men didn't want her because, you know, she was a lot older now. And she always just wanted male attention. I think she just wanted a man to love her and see her as desirable. I'm not too sure. Gertrude began to become depressed, and she actually did develop an illness. And her oldest daughter, Paula, actually kind of used this to her advantage, and she would have all the neighborhood kids come over. She would throw all these parties at their house, and it became the neighborhood hangout. A lot of the kids really liked it because they looked at Gertrude as this fun mom. I think we can all, at some point in our life, maybe not all, but where there was always that one parent who was not actually a parent, and you might have thought, oh, they're a really cool parent because we can come over and do these cool things. We're only like 16. I think that was the vibe. And Gertrude liked that. Gertrude liked that she was always complimented on. She was told that she was a cool mom. She was a better mom than all the other moms because she let them do all this. And so she began to really like this. She was like, oh wow, like these boys like me. Boys. Yes, boys. And she would actually do a striptease for one of them who was 15 at the time. So definitely stellar woman there. But yeah, she was very poor. And this kind of takes us back to the case where she was very poor. She needed money. And, you know, she was struggling a lot with her mental health and her physical health. Some believe that she might have had borderline personality disorder. I'm not going to really comment on that because I don't actually know. And I also don't want to stigmatize the disorder. But this is where Gertrude had seen her daughters talking to Sylvia and Jenny. It's speculated that Betty, the mom of Jenny and Sylvia, was released from like jail after, you know, getting out, but she wasn't really fit to take care of her daughters, and she was going to go off with Lester anyways. And Gertrude was talking to Lester, and so she kind of mentioned that she was poor and that, you know, why don't you, like, I can take care of your daughters if you need someone. And, you know, she was like, I have 7 other kids. Lester kind of was like, yeah, these girls know my daughters, that won't make it awkward for them. And, you know, Gertrude had 7 kids. What's 2 other kids, right? And these kids all range from 1 to 17. And, you know, Lester was like, you know what? That's probably fine. It's only going to be for a few months. And so he agreed to paying Gertrude $20, which would be roughly around $200 American every week. One of the big faults of Lester is if he would have just went to Gertrude's home, I think this case would have just never existed. I don't know if that's for sure, but Gertrude's home was very broken down. There was like dust everywhere. And I'm not just talking like a dusty house. I'm talking like filth. There was just like nothing clean in that home. It was very neglectful. There wasn't that much food, and there wasn't even enough beds for all the kids, let alone Jenny and Sylvia. But yeah, he never checked. So Sylvia and Jenny ended up moving into Gertrude's home on July 4th of 1965. And they were only supposed to stay until the family returned. I'm not too sure exactly when their actual date was supposed to be, but they were there for a total of 3 months. The first few weeks were pretty normal from my research. It said that the girls would, you know, listen to pop records, and they would go to school, and they would go to church services, they would do chores and all that. But after 3 months, Lester's agreement of paying $20 slowly declined. I believe that he'd be late like a few days, and Gertrude was like really pissed off about this because she needed the money. Now, instead of her just saying to Sylvia and Jenny, hey, I need you guys to leave because I can't afford to feed you guys if your dad's not going to pay me, go find someone else to live at, whatever, she decided to punish the sisters by taking a paddle and beating them. She would make the statement, well, I took care of you two little bitches for a week for nothing, and would continue to beat them. There was an occasion where she actually beat them 15 times on the back with this paddle. Paula, the oldest daughter, who was 17, would also play into this. She was a lot jealous that the boys liked Sylvia, and so was Gertrude. Paula at the time was actually 3 months pregnant, and so she was obviously, gaining weight and all this, and boys didn't want a girl who's pregnant at 17, and, Sylvia was kind of like the new girl on the block, right? And she was absolutely gorgeous just in general, and I think boys just liked that. They just liked her, and this caused Paula and even Gertrude to be very jealous. And so Paula would kind of like whisper into Gertrude's ears about like the girls and what they were doing and like Sylvia. And so she actually accused Sylvia and Jenny of eating way too much food at the church supper that they all attended by basically saying, oh, they were taking like seconds and all that. And they were making us look like we don't feed them and we're so poor. They're trying to make a statement, like just delusional crap. And so with this would kind of cause Gertrude to, get pissed off more and, they would beat them. And the abuse mainly began to target Sylvia. Like I said, a lot of people speculate that it was because she was very pretty, and boys liked Sylvia and they didn't like Gertrude and they didn't like Paula as much anymore. And instead of them just being like, well, yeah, she's a 16-year-old girl, of course other teenage boys will like a 16-year-old girl instead of a 37-year-old woman, they just took that out to be abusive. Sylvia would protect Jenny. She would kind of say, hey, beat me. It's my fault. I'm older. Or, kind of saying, oh, Jenny, she has polio, like all this stuff. I personally believe that this would piss off Gertrude more because when Gertrude was being abused, she never had that. She never had that person that would defend her. And I think it honestly legitimately triggered her. And I don't mean like just triggered. I mean actually triggered her. And I think it just made her angry that she never had that. And instead of her looking at Sylvia like, wow, what a great and kind person, she just got more angry. And this would cause her to, target Sylvia a lot more. And so Sylvia had actually mentioned that there was this boy she had that was her boyfriend back in Long Beach, California, that she began dating in the spring of this year of 1965. And Gertrude had actually asked Sylvia if she had ever done anything with this boy. And, Sylvia's really naive. She's kind of like, well, yeah, we do a lot of things together. We like go skating together. We hang out at the beach. We watch movies. Like, she's not thinking anything suggestive that, Gertrude was thinking. Sylvia had actually talked to Jenny and Stephanie, which was the other sister, about how she actually laid under the sheets with this boy. And Gertrude asked her, why would you do that? And Sylvia was like, I don't know. And then a few days after this, Gertrude decided to kind of poke fun at Sylvia's body. She started making comments about her being pregnant and that her stomach was too big. And from my research, I wasn't there in the room. Sylvia kind of took it as a joke. I'm not too sure if this is actually accurate because, none of us were there. But she did say, yeah, it sure is getting big. I'm going to have to go on a diet. I think she kind of was saying that to try and be funny, or maybe she was insecure about her body too, and that was her way of combating it. But Gertrude decided to teach us as a little lesson to all the other girls in the room. This is what happens when you do anything with a boy, you get pregnant, which is just very not practical, good information for girls, because then you're just teaching them that you're not really teaching them how pregnancy actually happens. And that's why there's a lot of teen pregnancies sometimes. And so Paula decided to kick Sylvia off the chair, saying you don't fit to sit in a chair. And then Gertrude would actually kick Sylvia in the stomach. And I think this is so insane because, Paula was pregnant. Now, I'm not saying she should have done it to Paula, but it's very interesting that, she would target Sylvia for being, quote, pregnant, not actually pregnant. But Paula's pregnant. And the thing about Paula is it's actually kind of disturbing because she was actually pregnant with a man who was married in his 40s. And mind you, she was 17. So she probably was getting groomed, or she was getting groomed. No matter the situation, she was getting groomed. She was a 17-year-old. So I'm not saying that Gertrude obviously should have done it, but I just think very hypocritical that you're going to pick on this girl for being pregnant when your daughter is actually pregnant. Very okay. So this is kind of when the torment began to get a lot worse. The abuse would happen the moment the girls came home from school or on the weekends or whenever they were just really home. The abuse was consistent of beating, starving Sylvia, forcing her to eat leftovers or spoiled food out of garbage cans. They didn't have a lot of food, so when she was getting like leftovers, it wasn't just like, oh, leftovers. It probably was like crumbs or spoiled food. And so she wasn't really getting the nutrients. She wasn't getting anything. And there was this one occasion where there was this neighborhood boy named Randy, and there was like this little dinner going on. And Randy and Paula grabbed a hot dog and they filled it with all kind of condiments and spices to the point where the hot dog was no longer like a hot dog. They told Sylvia to eat it, and Sylvia was like, no, I'm not eating that. And then they forced her to sit down and they shoved the hot dog in her mouth, which caused her to throw up, and then they forced her to eat her vomit. It's alleged that the only act of revenge that Sylvia ever did was spread a rumor that Paula and Stephanie were prostitutes. But in some of my research, it says that this didn't happen. So I can't really confirm that. But due to this rumor, Stephanie was told about it and apparently had asked Sylvia if she had ever started this rumor. And Sylvia did admit to it. So I don't know if she admitted to it because it did happen or if she felt forced to. But let's just kind of put that in there. But after she admitted to it, this caused Stephanie to punch Sylvia right in the face. But then they both kind of like started crying and they apologized to each other and they kind of like were okay with it. But Stephanie's boyfriend had heard about this rumor and he did not take it well. He brutally beat Sylvia up, slapping her and banging her head against the wall over and over. And when Gertrude saw this, she kind of was like, oh, wait a minute. I actually like seeing a man beat Sylvia up because they were a lot stronger than the girls in the house. And so she kind of would like invite the teenage boys to come in and beat Sylvia up. After Gertrude had heard of this rumor, she also had beat Sylvia up. And then Paula was beating Sylvia up to the point she had beat Sylvia so hard she broke her own wrist. And then when she got that cast on, she would beat her with the cast. So insane. Like when I was researching this, it almost feels like it's not real because it's like, it just sounds so aggressive, like just so over the top where you're just like, oh my God. Around this time though, Gertrude would spread rumors that Sylvia was promiscuous and a prostitute, which actually caused men around the town to sexualize poor Sylvia and make comments to her and like try and make advances on her. How fucking awful and disgusting. But Gertrude and her daughters weren't the only one that really did beat Sylvia and even the teenage boys. They would also force Jenny to beat her own sister, and if she didn't do it, she would also be beat. And I think Sylvia kind of understood that. I think she knew that her sister was doing this because she was forced to. But I'm not going to speak for Sylvia or Jenny, but... So Coy Hubbard and a couple other classmates would also come over and they would beat Sylvia, and they would just, abuse her, torment her. They would verbally abuse her, while Gertrude would kind of like egg them on, like telling them to keep doing it. They would use Sylvia as a dummy in violent judo, and they would cut her skin, they would burn her skin with cigarettes up to 100 times, and then they would also injure her genitals. Gertrude would demand Sylvia to strip naked in the family room in the presence of all these teen boys and all of these people and her own kids and everyone in the family room. And she handed her a glass Pepsi bottle and told her to masturbate with it. She had said to Sylvia, show Jenny what kind of girl you are. Sylvia was a virgin, and so of course she actually struggled to fit the bottle, and this caused Gertrude to get pissed off, and so she grabbed the bottle and she shoved it inside Sylvia and then kept forcing her to do this while everyone was like saying things to her, very fucking disgusting. And then after she tried to take the bottle out, she couldn't. And then Gertrude grabbed the bottle and pulled it out, and it was like full of blood. That to me is like the most disgusting part. I mean, all of it is, it just makes my stomach turn when I hear that. Like, I just can't imagine all of that. This girl didn't do anything wrong. And this isn't even like the worst of the worst that happened to her. This was just continuously going on. Stephanie had actually heard, like, she was in the room when this happened, and I think she came out and was like shocked. Stephanie is like a very interesting person in this case. Stephanie didn't really partake in the abuse, but she also didn't stop it. But I'll kind of talk more about that in the case. Eventually, Gertrude would actually get the girls to stop attending school because Sylvia had actually confessed to stealing some gym clothes, because Gertrude wouldn't buy her any gym clothes, and so she needed them. And then she heard this, she decided to whip Sylvia with a 3-inch wide police belt and would talk about the evils of premarital sex and then would kick her. Stephanie would come out running to Sylvia's side saying she didn't do anything. And then a few days later, Jenny had actually done the same thing. She had stolen a single tennis shoe to wear to school on her strong foot, and, you know, this would cause them to get more angry. Now, the parents of Sylvia and Jenny did actually see their kids. Their schedule would allow them to come see and visit them for a bit. And the sisters were too scared to tell anyone what had happened in the fear that the abuse and torture would get worse. And they were also afraid, because Gertrude and Paula were always kind of around, and they were just afraid that if they said anything, that they would torture her. And Jenny was actually very scared to say anything because she saw how Sylvia was tortured. And I think she didn't want the same thing to happen to her, or, you know, all that. Me personally, I don't know how their parents didn't notice. I just feel like there's like a look away. I feel like you would have been able to notice that your daughter lost weight. I don't know. I don't want to blame the parents, but it's still like one of those things where, how did you not notice? After their parents would leave, Gertrude would kind of taunt Sylvia, say, "What are you going to do now, Sylvia, now that they're gone?" There was also another time when they actually had met up with their older sister, Diana, and told her what happened, and Diana didn't believe them. She just thought that they were just trying to leave this home, and I don't understand that. Like, to me, she was, I think, 18 at the time and married. I don't get why she didn't believe them. I don't know about you, but if I had a sibling or even someone I knew who came up to me and told me anything saying that they were being abused or whatever, I'd be like, okay, I believe you. I don't know why that's so complicated for people to believe. Like, what? But there was this time when the sisters had actually met Diana, and Sylvia was actually given a sandwich from Diana because she was so hungry. And Mary, who was this 11-year-old daughter of Gertrude, had actually saw this happen. And she told Gertrude that she saw the sisters, you know, eating. And so when Gertrude got the girls, whatever, she accused them of sinning and engaging in gluttony, which is just, oh my God. It's just, Gertrude and Paula actually choked Sylvia and beat her before forcing her into a scalding bath to clean her of her sins. There was a time when Gertrude was almost caught. There was this boy named Michael John Monroe. He actually had a dad who called the police to make an anonymous report that there was a girl living with Gertrude who had all these sores and cuts all over her body, and that she hadn't been seen attending school. And after a few freaking days, a nurse shows up to do a little visit, and Gertrude is claiming that she's also a nurse and that she had the two sisters. They had ran away from their previous home, and so she was kind of nursing them back to health, and that Sylvia was just such a terrible child and she was out of control. And the nurse was like, "Oh yeah, that totally sounds right. Okay, see you later." And they never did any other investigations. And then there was this couple, and they pissed me off. They actually saw the girls being abused, and they viewed Gertrude as an ideal mother and caretaker, even though they saw a black eye on Sylvia and even said that Sylvia was acting zombified. But they believed, you know, like, oh yeah, you know, they just need to be punished. I don't know what the hell happened in the 60s for like this type of shit just to be normalized. But yeah, in the beginning of October, Sylvia's abuse and torture had gotten so bad that she actually lost the control of her bladder and would constantly like wet herself, also from the fact that she was being sexually abused and all that. She was denied any bathroom access as a form of punishment, which, by the way, if someone has bladder issues and you're punishing them by not giving them the bathroom, that's also gonna mess them up. They also would tie her up in the basement. She was kept naked, rarely fed, and deprived of water. Sometimes she was tied to the railing of the basement stairs where her feet could hardly touch the ground. Gertrude increased the abuse and torture on Sylvia, accusing her of directly insulting the other children in a way to kind of taunt the other kids to beat her. One night, Gertrude held a knife and challenged Sylvia to fight her back. And Sylvia had just said she didn't know how to fight, and in response, Gertrude inflicted a wound to Sylvia's leg. I think Gertrude was trying to see if she would actually try and defend herself and then maybe try and use that back on her. But this woman is just so mentally insane. And I mean, like, legitimately, there is something wrong with this woman. The only time the torment and abuse would kind of stop was when the family would watch their favorite TV shows or they were sleeping. But the neighborhood kids would also, join in. They'd pay 5 cents to see Sylvia's body on display and humiliate her, beat her, scald her, burn her. During these times, Gertrude would also ask the kids to help tie and gag Sylvia up and place her in a scalding bath and rub salt into her wounds. John Jr., who was a son of Gertrude, who was also 12, would torment Sylvia at the time. She was malnourished and she was starving. And, he would, make soup for her and then he'd put it in front of her and then take it away from her. Just a way to mock her. Eventually, Gertrude kind of did let Sylvia sleep upstairs if she didn't wet herself. And so Sylvia got to sleep upstairs and she actually asked Jenny if she could get her some water. The next day, Sylvia had actually, wet herself because her bladder's all messed up, and Gertrude decides to punish her. And she decides to put a fucking Coke bottle again inside Sylvia and then orders her downstairs. But as she's about to walk, Gertrude's walking back in the kitchen and she gets an idea. She gets a brilliant idea to brand Sylvia. So she calls Sylvia to come back upstairs and she begins to take a needle and carve the words, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it," into Sylvia's stomach with this needle. And Gertrude was actually unable to finish the job because she was so freaking weak. She actually ordered a neighborhood boy named Richard Hobbs to finish the carvings. He claimed that he just did short and light etchings onto her skin, but continued even though he could see that Sylvia was in pain. This was basically the turning point for Sylvia. Sylvia had later that night turned to Jenny and said, "Jenny, I know you don't want me to die, but I'm going to die. I can tell it." The following day, Gertrude would have Sylvia write a fake letter detailing that she had ran away to mislead her parents. She was forced to write in this letter that there were these local boys that were abusing her. One of the things that was kind of crazy about this letter was she had Sylvia start the letter off by being like, "Dear Mrs. and Mr. and Mrs. Likens," and she wrote about how she was so bad and all these boys hated her and they were abusing her and she was running away. Gertrude honestly was not a smart woman, because if I were to write a letter to my mom, I would not write to my mom with her last name. I would be like, "Mom." I don't know if that's just me, but this woman was not smart. And then also in this letter, she had wrote about how, Gertrude was such a good woman and she was so great. That is so obviously telling. Why would anyone write a letter talking about how bad they are and then that this other person is so good? That's so suspicious. Come on. No brain cells there. Gertrude decided to create this amazing plan that she was going to have John Jr. and Jenny blindfold Sylvia and take her to a forest known as Jamie Forest, and they were just going to leave her there to die. Sylvia actually overheard this and she tried to escape, and she actually got outside, but her injuries were there was too much injury. She was very weak and Gertrude caught her. It's alleged that Gertrude tried to feed Sylvia crackers to kind of prolong Sylvia's death because she knew that she was going to die, and she was like, "No, I need you to stay alive so we can do this." And she would shove these crackers into Sylvia's mouth and then beat her with a curtain rod, which caused Sylvia to go unconscious, and then she was dragged to the basement. A neighbor had actually heard some screaming from Gertrude's house, but it ended at 3 a.m. and she didn't alert the police. I'm sorry, if I was in my house doing my thing and I heard screaming in the middle of the night and then go, oh, it stopped at 3 a.m, they're probably fine. What? I feel like there are so many people in this case that are actually like, they're not there. Like, what? Like, I don't know if it's just the 60s or people were just very dumb. I don't know. But like, what? I'm sorry if I'm getting a little heated. So the date now is October 26th of 1965. Sylvia had become really delirious. She couldn't speak properly. She couldn't move. Gertrude tried to feed her donuts and milk, but Sylvia couldn't even move the cup to her hand. Gertrude got angry and took her to the basement. And Paula had actually heard Sylvia moaning and mumbling. And so she went down there and she said to her to recite the alphabet. And Sylvia struggled to get past the first 4 letters. Paula threatened to jump on Sylvia if she did not stand up. What is the mind? Like, what is going on? Where is the thoughts? Like, where are they? That afternoon, Sylvia had a lot of her tormentors gather around the basement when she became more delirious. She turned to their faces and would point, "You're Ricky," and "You're Gertie," but she was saying it in such a delirious way. This caused Gertrude to get really angry, and she would tell her to shut up and that, you know I'm Gertrude, like, what are you trying to do? Sylvia got so delirious that she actually forgot she lost her front tooth because she actually tried to eat a pear and she was like confused at the pear. Like she was like, oh, I think my teeth are gone. And Jenny said, do you not remember? You don't have a tooth there, Sylvia. How sad. John Jr. actually tried to wash Sylvia with a garden hose as he laughed, and Sylvia tried to escape the basement, but she couldn't reach the stairs. And in these efforts, Gertrude had actually put her foot on Sylvia's head before just staring at her for like a long time and then just left. Like, what? So shortly around 5:30 p.m., Richard Hobbs went to the basement and he slipped on water and he fell down the frickin' stairs and he saw Stephanie crying and cuddling Sylvia's body, which she was ordered to clean. Stephanie and Richard gave Sylvia a warm and soapy bath, and they actually dressed her very nice. They laid her on a bed, and Sylvia had muttered her final wishes was, I wish Daddy was here, and that Stephanie would just take her home. Stephanie actually saw this as a sign that Sylvia might be okay because she was talking and she was actually breathing, and she actually attempted to do mouth to mouth, but it was too late. She actually had turned around telling everyone about how like it was going to be fine, but she had died. Gertrude accused Sylvia of faking her death, and she actually continued to beat her even when Sylvia was gone. Sylvia was just 16 years old when she died. Even in her death, she was still being tormented. Gertrude kept calling her a faker until she realized she was gone. So Gertrude kind of came up with this story and told all the kids this is what the story was going to be, that she was trying to nurse Sylvia up to her death because there was these boys that attacked her. And they even threatened Jenny, saying, if you say anything, we'll do worse to you. And so at 6:30 p.m., Gertrude had ordered Richard Hobbs to call the police. When the police arrived, they actually saw how beat up Sylvia was. And they were kind of like, shocked because, she looked malnourished, all of that. And during this time, Paula was seen walking in with a Bible, trying to look spiritual, and was proclaiming that this was God's will and told Jenny that she was now part of their family. Jenny somehow got the police alone, or she whispered, but she actually said to the police, you get me out of here and I will tell you everything. The police obviously were like, okay, let's go on. And Jenny told them everything about like the abuse, the torture, everything. And this caused the police to arrest Gertrude, Paula, Stephanie, and John Jr. on suspicion of murder. The same evening, Coy Hubbard, Richard Hobbs were also arrested. Paula, Stephanie, and John Jr. were placed in custody at a nearby juvie detention center, and they were actually held without bail. The younger kids in the house were placed in a guardian home. And so Gertrude tried to deny everything. She claimed that she had memory loss. I see this so much in abuse cases. I don't know what it is with abusers and memory loss. Like, they just love to use that. Like, it's like their get out of jail card. Like, oh, I don't remember any of this. Shut up. She went on to say she was sick and that she couldn't have done this. But the next day, on October 27th, she confessed to knowing that some of the abuse was happening and that Paula and Coy were the ones who were mostly abusive. Literally just threw her kids under the bus. I'm not giving them like an out for this, but it's just like, I don't know. You always see this when there's like a parental figure and another person that's also the abuser, they're always like, oh no, it was them, it's not me, I'm this poor, sick, old parent. Like, so pathetic. Paula showed no signs of remorse, and even when admitted to beating Sylvia up, had shown no signs of remorse even when she was admitting to beating Sylvia up. And this is actually jumping a little bit ahead in the case, but there was this girl named Grace Sargent who was used as a witness of the trial, and she actually had testified that she heard Paula on the church bus of all places, bragging about breaking her own wrist due to beating Sylvia up, and she even said, I tried to kill her, and she was like proud of it. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to mention that. 5 of the neighborhood kids were also charged, which were Michael Monroe, Randy Lepper, Darlene McGuire, and Judy Duke, and Anna Cisco. They were charged for causing injury, but they were actually released to their parents under the acceptance of being witnesses in the trial. Sylvia's body was revealed to have suffered 150 separate wounds. She was heavily weak and sick and malnourished. Her injuries included burns, severe bruising, extensive muscle and nerve damage. Her genitals were swollen shut. Her fingernails were broken backwards, and a lot of her skin had actually peeled off. Her cause of death was listed as subdural hematoma. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I'm so sorry. Due to her having the blow to her right temple, which caused prolonged damage and also malnutrition. The coroner, Dr. Keeble, had stated that rigor mortis had officially developed by the time Sylvia's body was discovered, which could indicate that she had been dead up to 8 hours, but due to Stephanie and Richard giving her a bath, that probably actually sped up the rigor mortis. Her funeral was held on October 29th of 1965 at the Russell and Hitch Funeral Home back in her hometown, Lebanon, Indiana. More than 100 people attended, and her casket was left open with a picture of her. December 30th of 1965, the Marion County Grand Jury returned with a degree murder indictments against Gertrude, Paula, John Jr., Richard Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard. They were all charged with kicking, beating, causing fatal injuries to Sylvia with malice. Stephanie actually was released due to her not having any evidence of her actually partaking in the abuse, which does make sense because, like, she wasn't really doing any of it. But at the same time, she could have stopped it. She could have called the police. Like, she is, to me, like, she's still a bystander. A little prior to the trial, in March of 1966, there was a lot of psychiatrists who did psych evaluations on everyone to make sure that they were all stable and sane and that they were fit to stand trial. And Gertrude tried claiming that she was actually mentally insane, but they were like, no, you're not. So April 18th of 1966, the trial officially began. The prosecutors Leroy New and Marjorie Wessner had announced that they were seeking the death penalty for all 5, and even stated that they should be charged and tried together since they were all working together, and that trying them all just wouldn't really get the same image because, you know, if you were just like, oh, well, they beat her one day, like, it wasn't really going to add up. They needed the full story. So Coy, Richard, Paula, and John Jr. all claimed that they had been pressured into doing torment and abused by Gertrude. On May 2nd and 3rd, Jenny would actually testify saying that they all had equal parts to play and that they would repeatedly abuse her sister, both physically and emotionally, and also stated that Sylvia didn't have any part to play in this at all. Jenny also claimed that, you know, the rumors that Sylvia was like calling people prostitutes and whores and bitches was just lies against Sylvia's character. And Jenny also mentioned she went through some of the abuse, but it wasn't the same extent. And Jenny would end her testimony crying and recalling how Sylvia knew she was going to die. Randy Lepper would show no remorse. Same thing with Paula. He actually had smirked when he retold the story of beating Sylvia up 40 different times. There was a few witness statements, such as a Baptist minister named Roy, who claimed he knew the abuse was happening, but that Gertrude said that she was being, Sylvia was being punished for being a prostitute, so I guess that makes it okay, right? So stupid. Judy Duke was 13. She actually admitted to watching Sylvia endure the salt being pushed on her wounds. And Shirley, who was a younger sibling, said she saw Sylvia's blouse being ripped open, to which Richard Hobbs made the remark, everybody's having fun with Sylvia. Again, Gertrude would try and sit there claiming she was, you know, too mentally and physically ill to even know this was happening. Mary, the 11-year-old, also gave a witness statement where she actually claimed and admitted that she heated the needle for Richard Hobbs to brand Sylvia. She broke down crying while saying this. She also gave a character witness statement saying Gertrude didn't care when Sylvia was being abused, and stated that Gertrude sat on the patio and watched Sylvia being beat up by Anna Sisco. I do want to say that like the younger children definitely were also being abused into doing these things. The trial lasted for 17 days, and on May 19th of 1966, the jury found Gertrude guilty of first-degree murder, Paula a second-degree murder, and Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard, and John Jr. were all charged with manslaughter. And, Gertrude was seen crying at the trial and comforting her kids. Paula and Gertrude were sentenced to life in prison, and Richard, Coy, and John Jr. were sentenced to 2 to 21 years to serve. In September of 1970, there was a retrial, and Paula had pled guilty, and she felt like it wasn't fair. And so she was actually then sentenced to 2 to 20 years. But Gertrude tried to do the retrial, and she was convicted again. Richard, John Jr., and Coy served less than 2 years before they were all granted parole in 1968. And Richard actually died of lung cancer at the age of 21. Coy Hubbard went on to continue making crimes and actually was charged of another murder of 2 young men in 1977, and he even had witnesses, but he was let off early. He was acquitted of his charges. But in 2007, there was actually a premiere titled An American Crime, which is a movie told about Sylvia's life. And once it was released, Coy was actually fired from his job, and then he died at the age of 56 from a heart attack. John Jr. and the rest of the Gertrude children changed their last names to Blake, including Stephanie, and she actually became a school teacher. She got married and had kids, and she was just last seen in Florida. And that's all we could really find on her. John Jr. actually issued a statement saying that him and the other defendants were sentenced too easily and should have had a harsher sentence, which I find very interesting that he would say that. He would become a lay minister and would do counseling sessions for children of divorced parents, which I just think that's really insane. He should not be around children. He died in 2005. Paula was released and was on parole in 1972. She changed her identity to Paula Pace and concealed the truth about her life and criminal activity. And one of the most insane things is that she actually worked as an aide for a school counselor for 14 years in Conrad, in Iowa. But in 2012, her identity was found out and she was fired. Like, oh my God. Gertrude had actually stayed in prison for 14 years and actually was really well liked by the other inmates. She was considered the mom of the group. She would work in the sewing shop. She changed her name to Nadine Van Fossen, which was her middle and maiden name. She, of course, said she was a devoted Christian, which we always hear, what is with this abuser to Christian pipeline is insane. Gertrude was given parole in December of 1985, and people were pissed. There was members of 2 anti-crime groups who traveled to Indiana and even received over 40,000 signatures over 2 months from citizens to have Gertrude stay in jail for life. Gertrude, gave a statement when she was being released, and she said, "I'm not sure what role I had in her death because I was on drugs and I never really knew her. I take full responsibility for what happened." Like, you're not taking full responsibility. She would then move to Iowa, and she actually moved to where Paula was, and she still claimed she didn't know what happened. She couldn't recall the memories, and she actually died of lung cancer at 61 in 1990. When Jenny heard of her death, she actually cut out a newspaper and mailed it to her mom and said, "Some good news, damn old Gertrude died, ha ha ha, I'm happy about that," which I think that's kind of funny. That's something I would have done, honestly. Jenny was very traumatized, though, from this whole shitstorm. She was on anxiety medication for her entire life. But she did end up getting married and having kids, but she died at the young age of 54 from a heart attack. Betty and Lester died in 1998 and 2013. They actually ended up getting divorced a little bit after this thing had happened. Jenny actually would go on to say that her parents were not to blame for putting her and Sylvia in the care of Gertrude. I don't know if that's her way of protecting her parents or what, but... So, a little bit of the aftermath is the home where Sylvia was tortured was named the House of Murder and was actually supposed to turn into a women's shelter, but it laid vacant for years and then was demolished in April of 2009. In June of 2001, there was a granite memorial dedicated to Sylvia's life and a legacy in Willard Park, Indianapolis. There were several hundred people who attended, and there was a statement etched in it that says, "This memorial is in memory of a young child who died a tragic death. As a result, laws change and awareness increase. This is a commitment to our children that the Indiana Police Department is working to make this a safe place for our children." Sylvia's death increased the understanding and recognition of abuse, and there actually became a law stating that if anyone of the public suspects a child is being abused or neglected, it's their obligation to report it, which I think is really good that they kind of did create that, because there's so many people who saw it and just didn't do anything. And then in 2010, there was an advocacy center titled Boone County Child Advocacy Center, but it was changed to the Sylvia Child Advocacy Center in 2016. And the executive director stated, "The most important thing we can do is tell kids they are hurt and we are listening. This was something no one did for young Sylvia. Her family is thankful, though. It doesn't have to be that way anymore. She did not die in vain. She died a horrific death, but because of that, we're hoping that another child can be saved." And I think that is the best way to end this. I think that this case is horrendous, and yeah, if anyone wants to add anything to this case, if I missed anything, if I said anything wrong, let us know in the comments. And with that, we'll see you in the next episode.